many reasons. One of the many reasons I'm doing this webinar. For those of you that are not familiar with Manchester, I'm a little bit biased. It's famous for a lot of things. Keeping on the football, obviously the world's most famous football team, Man United. But there's a few things in this slide that you might not know about Manchester. Some very clever people split the atom and invented the computer and started kind of women's right to vote movement. Unfortunately, well, it was good at the time, but not now. The Northwest and the Midlands in the United Kingdom basically started the Industrial Revolution with the use of coal for steam trains, etc., and lots of factories. So the picture you see there is when I jump in the tram going to work, you know, mixture of modern and old. But this is what it was like in 1960. That is the art gallery round the corner from me now. And if the environment can speak, it was screaming out there saying, we need environmental legislation. Which brings me very nicely onto the topic. Now, the first thing with net zero is you need to know what it means. And I'll tell you first of all what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean having zero emissions. You'll see a definition of zero carbon there, reducing emissions to absolute zero without offsetting. I think it's fair to say we would not have a functioning society if there was no carbon. So there will be carbon. What the proper definition of net zero, and it was in the Paris Agreement, is basically balancing the greenhouse gas emissions from sources with the amount of carbon removal from sinks. Sinks are things like the ocean and forests, etc. Now, the important thing about this slide is there's another definition that's quite it's used a lot: carbon neutral. Now, in environmental terms, carbon neutral is a bit of a cop-out. You could be a polluter, not given a monkeys about reducing your emissions, but by buying basically carbon offsets, you can, hit your targets. So net zero was really where we're all going to. It's come from the international law. It's now in individual companies, banks. Alethea was telling me we've got construction, banks, environmental groups, consultants, even people from the embassy on the call. The beautiful thing about this topic, it applies to everybody. So just keeping on that theme, this is a bit of a geography class recap. The Earth basically sorted itself out for billions of years. And relatively recently, when humans decided to extract fossil fuels and burn them, that's when the trouble started. Basically, we have pumped excess carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the air. The other big cause has been changes in land use. So lots of cattle, you've got methane from that, but actually development, cutting down trees, etc., that takes away the natural sinks. So think of it in two ways. In the left-hand column, reducing emissions, all the kind of good stuff we're trying to do: renewable energy, energy efficiency, electric vehicles. But on the other side, we can also achieve that balance by basically improving nature, reforestation, managing soil. There's a few other things, kind of high tech, like direct carbon capture. At scale, this is very, very hard to achieve. So that is not going to save us, just to keep it dramatic. So there you go, the legal definitions. The important thing is the Paris Agreement. There's two bits to it. The overall tactic, the strategy is to keep the increase in world temperatures to 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. Now, at the minute, we're at about 1.2, and at 1.5, actually, it gets an awful lot worse. The bad news, and I'm going to make this point over and over again, is we don't have a chance at all of achieving that, in my opinion. Article 4, there you say, there's the legal definition of the balance. Now, when it comes to making targets, at the end of the day, a target is just a target. You need action. So the UK's target, it's when we talk about net zero, we're not talking about the pre-industrial levels. We have set a baseline of 1990, and by 2050, we want our carbon account to be at least 100% lower. So that's different to the Paris Agreement. Every company on this call will have their own targets with different baselines. They're quite hard to compare, and I'll come on to the SBTI later in the talk. Keeping it simple, we have got a climate emergency. This is showing at a glance the increase in temperatures from the Industrial Revolution to fairly recently. We also have a nature emergency, not all connected to climate change, but a lot of it is. The rest of it is basically pollution, development, bad land use, shocking behavior if you actually think about it, and initiatives like biodiversity net gain that we have in the UK is trying to change that. This slide I find very interesting, and if any of you have to do talks on net zero, or even if it's just internally, I'd encourage you to use this slide. It looks at the big picture of all the major issues that we all face. You'll hear it in the news, you talk about it with your friends, family. Right now, and in the next 2 years, no surprises what's on the list: economic downturn, migration, cyber insecurity, misinformation. Trump's must be at the top of that list. And of course, all of this horrible armed conflict that's affecting economies all over the world. But look in 10 years, the top 4, it's all about the environment, climate change, and nature. Very simple terms. We're in one planet. When you actually mess up the thing that we actually look after, that we need to live, we're in trouble. And believe me, we are in trouble. Now, the IPCC, the collection of world scientists, have been saying for decades that we're in trouble, but this is their most recent report, 2021, the main report, and they said code red for humanity. Nobody is safe. We must treat climate change as an immediate threat. That's pretty black and white to me. And the reason for that, this is what's happening with 1.2 degrees increase in the world. You will have seen examples of all of these things over the last couple of years with increased regularity. The bit that, 3 things I think you will see more of. One will be food supply problems. The other one will be climate-related migration. And the last one is tipping points, irreversible tipping points. You might have heard that in the tundra, there's lots of methane under the ground. It's getting hot up there, particularly in the summer, and the methane can get released. Now, if it does that, hundreds of thousands of tons at a time going into the atmosphere, it basically banjaxes the whole weather system, and we're in trouble. Everything just speeds up and goes out of control. The systems break down. Now, I mentioned migration there. I went to Seville to watch Glasgow Rangers, and I went on one of these bus tours, and I had to buy a hat, and I thought this is the hottest place I've been to in the world. Now, I looked over the bus and I saw some dogs. I've never seen dogs looking so hot and bothered. And I thought, Seville's, what a beautiful, beautiful city. But you can see trouble ahead. You can see with the lack of, it's not near the sea, has water obviously in the river, but it was so hot. And Spain in particular will find it really, really difficult. And I think that in its own is a call to action to take this, to move faster. It's all about climate action. Right, let's see it how the world, the powers that be, the governments have tackled this problem that's affecting us all. Well, the mother of all legislation back in 1992 basically said, let's have a commitment to reduce emissions to prevent dangerous interference. Now, the best thing this conference did was set up the Conference of the Parties. Every year you have these COP climate conferences that kind of generally say the same thing. But it's interesting how this all started. NASA in America came up with a report. You can nearly imagine going in to see the president. Hey, we've got a problem here. Climate change, it's real. And we can see what's going to happen. As a result of that, Margaret Thatcher in the UK gave an impassioned speech to the UN General Assembly. The evidence is here. The damage is being done. What are we going to do about it? There you go, 1992. That's a long time ago. And really, it's only started to speed up in the last couple of years. After the Rio conference, you had Kyoto. This was important as the first legally binding emission reduction targets, but it wasn't ratified by China or the US. Didn't include international aviation or shipping. So basically, it was a bit of a damp squid, but it was progress, I guess. The big one, as I've said, the Paris Agreement will have these two things, the 1.5, that balance the net zero target by 2050. If we can reach that, there's a good chance of maybe keeping under 2 degrees. The other good thing about this conference, individual countries, not just a small number of them, have to come up with their own emission reduction targets effectively every 5 years, so you can compare them. Britain took centre stage in the Glasgow COP. Boris was very pleased to announce the net zero strategy. They said we have the first legally binding targets for a country in the world. But there was a lot of a lot of talk, really. The main thing was on the financial side. 130 trillion was kind of promised, and private assets ready for the big companies, the banks, to invest. I mean, there's a few banks on the call. I'm sure you're all getting heavily involved in these projects, but at the international level, still pretty slow. Look at that. US and China said, let's have enhanced actions, whoopee-doo. If you're on LinkedIn, that's my fairly sarcastic take on the Glasgow Climate Pact, left blowing in the wind after last-minute interventions. Now, in the most recent one, of course, how do you save the planet? You get the CEO of a fossil fuel business to basically be the convener. And okay, it mentions coal, but you can see a couple of cop-outs here. Acceleration of efforts. Yeah, let's try harder. Phase down, unabated. The big word for me here that I've lots of chemical and waste clients, and is all about transitioning. To me, transitioning effectively means business as usual for as long as possible for the polluting companies that don't really want to change very quickly because it's all about profits. Now, back to the UK. As I say, we were very proud to have this Climate Change Act, but we set a target of 80%, then realized actually that's behind the rest of the world. Let's play catch up, and we changed that. That was a little bit embarrassing. This was the big net zero strategy I mentioned from Boris. So great. The High Court ruled it unlawful. So they came up with a new carbon budget delivery plan, went to court again, probably by Greenpeace. They said that's unlawful too. But at least they were trying. We have basically the school teacher called the Climate Change Committee. And every year they check how the UK is doing. I'm not sure if in Spain if you've got a similar thing. But here, their reports are well worth the read. Scathing in their attack of their government. They said, we're not confident for the first time of meeting, these 5-year budgets. The overall action is worryingly slow. The rate of annual emissions reduction must quadruple. So we must go 4 times quicker. And the catch thing was the government must stay firm with bolder delivery. Don't try and get away from your commitments, these targets. So what did we do in response? Complete U-turn. And the last Conservative government, using the thing of, lower income families, honesty, sensible leadership. Basically, we moved back we had 2030 targets for electric vehicles and all this sort of stuff, and boilers. We've moved it back by 5 years. We'll probably also move back the EPC. This is upgrading buildings. The minute we have to go from an E to a B by 2030, I think that'll change. The good thing, though, with this is the government basically put 2 fingers and said, no, this up and down, good, bad cop stuff from government isn't good enough. We need certainty. And there's been a backlash from industry. Basically, companies, banks, financial world, they realize that we have to move quicker. And that to me is encouraging. Since it's quite topical, we had the change of government very recently here in the UK, which seems to be pretty good on net zero, I have to say. Ed Miliband, I've seen talk quite, a lot of people in the environmental world are very pleased with that. But one of his things that he asked for was £28 billion a year of green investment, and he was overruled within his own party. So you can see how politics and delivery and development, the environmental protection, it's the same thing. It has been forever, but it will not be easy. But look at some of the other countries, Russia, the United States. We've got trouble ahead. Even France, which we thought we're going to have this kind of far right government, and now we have a coalition of left. But when I saw that the leader of the National Rally do his kind of commiseration speech, he basically said, well, these guys will mess themselves up themselves. The left coalition will come back stronger. In the meantime, I'm head of the right wing European Parliament group, and we're powerful, and we will limit the EU's Green Deal. So there's going to be a massive push against everything net zero action and environmental. You'll see it across the world. But from looking at this from afar, I've been an environmental lawyer 30 years. I've known climate change for a long time, and I deliberately took a side. Well, it was a bit of a cop-out. I didn't basically say, yeah, this is an area I should get involved in. I kind of thought the big London law firms doing their carbon markets and all this sort of stuff. I'm not in a law firm that can compete with that. I'll leave that to them and the banks. And then I saw the raft of legislation flying in. Now, 30 years ago, I would go up to companies and give all the good reasons why you should improve your environmental performance. It's the same thing as net zero action. It's good for the environment, less greenhouse gas emissions, good for makes your employees feel good. It's healthy. Everybody likes it. Good for reputation. It's a no-brainer. But when I said that message, people said, yeah, nice to know, nice to have, but no thanks. We need to make money. And this is where the big change in the market has come. It's the change with mandatory accounting, reporting, and changes at the international and EU level. And I'll just explain that now. You probably all know this, but any of you that don't, the greenhouse gas protocol is the kind of rules for measuring greenhouse gases, and scope 1 effectively is your own stuff, scope 2 renewable electricity, scope 3 is the big one, which is your real carbon footprint, which is often over 80%, is to do with your value chain. This is upstream and downstream value chain emissions, and I've given some examples there in the third column. This is very, very hard to influence, and companies across the world will find over the next 5-10 years this is the big challenge. Now, I mentioned this raft of legislation. In the UK, we had 2013, 2018, we had 2 Company Act type regulations that basically said very big companies have to measure and report in their accounts, in their annual accounts, greenhouse gas emissions. Fair enough, but what they said was scope 3, the really important one, is optional. Now, you could just say what actually happened in Europe was they took a very different approach. They've said scope 3 is mandatory. That is the sensible thing. European legislation on environmental issues has always been much wiser and, in my opinion, much better. We'll look at these 2 directives in a minute, but check this boy in the middle. The Global Sustainability Standard and Climate-Related Disclosures sounds a little bit boring, but very, very, very important. For the first time ever, international comparative accounting language that everyone will start to follow. It'll take a number of years, but it starts with the money, guys. It comes down. This is really, really important. Now, look at these 2 directives. So mandatory ESG reporting. So my first job was at Eversheds in London, and I was asked to look at the environmental report from Shell. And Keith, what do you think of this? And the front sort of 10 pages were, we are brilliant. We've changed our logo. We're great for the environment. You know, it doesn't mention the obvious. When you go into the small print, you know, we've had this massive pollution incident. Lots of people have died, you know, really serious stuff, but it was basically a PR exercise. But with mandatory ESG reporting linked to, it's called the ESRS, sorry for acronyms, but basically there are reporting standards that the big companies in Europe will now be following. So you might have 15 different environmental type and social and government topics, and you have to follow the rules and people can compare them. And this will improve standards. But the big one, as I just said, because it impacts scope 3 companies, so your international supply chain. If you're based in the UK, you are brought in under this phased approach. I think it's 2029, you must report on your 2028 data, and have set out the financial thresholds on employees. What I found even more interesting is the more recent directive that just got approved on the 24th of May by the council. Very, very controversial, but I think it'll have a very important impact in the market. A legal due diligence duty to identify and prevent actual and potential adverse human rights and environmental impacts. Think of all the environmental impacts any big company can have. I do transactions. Every transaction, you have non-compliance, you have pollution. Every site has got contaminated land. People are breaching the law every day, and this is a potential adverse environmental impact. So it's quite a wide thing. That's just for environment. Human rights covers a whole lot of other stuff. And here's the key to it. You've got an annual audit of your own operations, your subsidiaries, and parts of your international supply chain. And if you mess up and you have big contracts that are worth millions of pounds, those contracts can effectively be ripped up if you cannot resolve these impacts, negative impacts. Then you can have third parties that can come and whack you over the head, and they have 5 years to bring a claim. And here's the good one. Supervising authorities can name and shame you or levy fines of 5% of your net worldwide turnover. Now, big companies went, banjacks, this is ridiculous. And I think it was France and maybe Germany or Italy and Germany that they were going to basically pull out, because everyone has to agree this directive. And the original thresholds, I think it was like 250 million euros, that got moved to 450 million euros, and the 500 employees got bumped up to 1,000 employees. And you'll see there's a phase, so it's even bigger numbers for the first. So you look at that at the start, say, no, that's okay, that doesn't affect us. But going back to my previous thing, yes, it might only be 9,000 companies in the EU, but it's the international supply chain. They will ask companies cascading down, what are you doing? And they ask their supply chain, what are you doing? And this has a massive effect in the market. This has been the big change why environment has gone from bottom of the pile to top of the pile, and everyone's taking it seriously. It's in the accounts, it's in your it's in your ESG reports, and people can call you to account. Just going back to that comment I made about transactions. You cannot have a warranty in a transaction to say this company complies completely with all environmental laws, or it'd be very unwise to have one, because there's breaches, as I said, with pretty much everything. But with ESG, some companies are actually saying, you know, we go on, we're better, we go beyond compliance. So if you can't say in a transaction when there's, I don't know, 50 million quid at stake, we can't materially comply. But an ESG report says we are the bee's knees and we're fantastic. ESG reports will be used against you. So from a practical point of view, you actually need lawyers to check them. Now, this ISSB, this International Sustainability Standards Board that launched the International Accounting Standards, they will have a far-reaching effect. You don't need to know what all of these things mean, but basically, no matter what you have to report on with energy, greenhouse gas emissions, ESG, it'll come back pretty much to the middle. And the EU rules are seen as the best. Right, on to corporate climate action. I've just made, I think, very clearly the point that governments and politics and the obvious difficulties there will not save us. What are the companies going to do? Well, this is a big statement back 2021 from BlackRock. No issue ranks higher than climate change on our clients' list of priorities. I'm not really seeing that yet in corporate transactions, but certainly for banks, the big companies, this is like a boardroom issue. And you will all probably attending the call or watching this video later will have your own targets already. But Irwin Mitchell, we've decided to go 10 years earlier. And some of our, so 2040 is our net zero for the whole supply chain. We've already reached our 2025 target a little bit early. So all that's looking quite good. But our environmental manager finds it very, very hard. There are some things with companies that are just not popular. Partners are given a car. I don't have one because I live the tram 10 minutes away. But partners like to have their cars. Some partners like to go to international conferences. We're part of First Law International. It would be hard for me to say, I would like to talk about net zero and fly all over the world. And I don't know why there's so many people at the COP, but there you go. It's a bit of a cop-out. Now, so companies come up with their own voluntary net zero standards, targets. I said Irwin Mitchell 2040. It's one that anyone could come up with a target. I could say to my family, I've got a target to be better tomorrow, and it probably won't happen. But these targets are you need to have a big tick of approval. And the main act is the Science Based Targets Initiative, and just loads and loads of companies fairly recently, look at this, the last 3 or 4 years are now saying, oh yes. Why are they doing that? Because in tenders they're saying, do you have a target? Yes, but is it approved? Oh crikey, we better get it approved. That's why you spend money to get this. The money, 2030, it would cost you $9,500 just to get your near-term target verified. Same again for your long-term target. But look, I said right at the start when I did the kind of geography picture of the sources and the sinks, it's a balanced job. SBTi said at the start, we will not let carbon offsetting come into this. You can only have verified reductions when you get to the very, very bottom. You know, the residual stuff that's really hard to get rid of. You've tried your best. Okay, then you buy some sort of accredited, verified offsets. But because so many companies have now signed up to this and they're going, crikey, we're not going to hit our targets in 2030, 2050. They've campaigned pretty hard, and SBTi have actually backtracked and say, you know what, we might change our own rules and let you do more of these verified carbon removal projects. So you're going to see more and more of this in the market. As I say, this is a very general overview for the purpose of this webinar. Now, the main theme, very big companies have to hit the targets. 80% is your supply chain. So to hit your targets, you have to basically get everybody below you, pull them up, bring them along your journey. So SMEs are being asked for environmental policy statements, climate policies, pledges, approved targets, transition plans, environmental management systems, evidence of sustainability, action stuff that's not just waffle. Or, are you really impressed if somebody says we have reduced, we've recycled 5% more paper? We're dealing with saving the planet here. You have to do real action. Now, lawyers in transactions influencing clients, part of the growth of big companies working for banks, play a very, very important role. And I, as an environmental lawyer who has spent a long time working with corporate lawyers around the country, there's 20 law firms that come to Irwin Mitchell for environmental advice, and I generally work with corporate lawyers. So I know corporate lawyers and their clients very, very well, and real estate lawyers. And believe me, environment has not been top of the list for a long time, but thankfully it is getting back to its deserved spot now. When ESG became trendy, every big law firm in London and nationally said, hey, we have to be the main ESG law firm because this is what our clients want. And this publication by in-house lawyers called Chasing the Dragon, it's a really good read. But two things that jumped out to me. One is the major themes of ESG. I was very pleased to see environmental liability pop in there. Now, many of you will not yet be familiar with the phrase PFAS, PFAS, pollution. This is forever chemicals. And the bad news, in addition to climate change, is it's in groundwater, it's in rain, it's in surface water, it's in the land. It's been discovered in the Antarctic. I took my son to the North Antrim coast, Northern Ireland, surfing, and I found out a week later that Shell had actually tested the same beach and found PFAS, probably coming from its own operations. It's absolutely everywhere. It's in our blood, and it is the cause of many cancers and other terrible, terrible diseases. PFAS, environmental liability, will cost millions for some big polluting companies. That is a major theme. Climate change is a major theme. Government, it all boils down to the leadership. I went to one of my early law firms and said, I think we should have an environmental management system. How much will it cost? Well, $5,000 for the first bit, might cost about 20 grand to get it implemented. No thanks. 20 years later, pretty much every big law firm has an environmental management system. You need to move early. You need to do it with conviction. You need to listen to environmental advisors. Now, what is the guidance for professional advisors? Well, the UN Race to Zero is a UN, obviously, initiative, but lots of companies, cities, etc., have signed up to this, and effectively, it's a way of getting a tick for your 2050 target. But they've come up with this fairly recent consultation on serviced emissions. And it basically says lawyers, a few other professions have to advocate system changes for accelerated transition. It's no good saying business as usual. So corporate transactions, if I'm an environmental lawyer, I shouldn't just ask for environmental permits and reports and pollution incidents. I need to ask, about net zero, ESG, how you're dealing with your supply chain. We all should be asking these questions. But this consultation says companies should develop their strategy for service emissions. Service emissions are basically, okay, after you get your own house in order, your scope 1, your scope 2, your influence with scope 3, what about scope 4? Scope 4 is actually the emissions of your clients. I'll use a good example. Ineos now own a bit of Man United, my football team. Now, I've mixed feelings about that. I love my football team. I want them to last forever. It's kind of my religion. But Ineos, very, very well run company and will do great things, I'm sure, for Man United. But at the end of the day, they're one of the UK's biggest polluters. The real reason they're going to be the savior of Man United is to get a good PR image of their name, Ineos. They don't want Ineos, the big bad polluters. They want Man United saviors. Service emissions basically says, okay, if Ineos, say Ineos, I was at Clifford Chance and Ineos was my client and I was head of corporate, I would probably say to the other partners, we're a bit worried. Say Ineos did some bad things. I'm sure they do great things, but say they've done bad things, you'd actually have to say, is it right for us as a big law firm to continue acting for this client? These are the sort of very, very difficult conversations that will be happening in the future. But it's all about engagement with your stakeholders, your clients, your intermediaries, your funders, your workers. What did the Law Society? The Law Society of England and Wales also said, this is guidance to lawyers, best practice. When you're speaking to clients, don't just say, is the price right? Is the time scale right on these transactions? Talk about your own net zero strategy, the risks, the opportunities, the good things, the bad things. Can you help each other with things that you found really good? But it says understand your client's strategy. So that basically means have these conversations with your clients. This is the future, the climate conscious law firm. Leadership is senior management. Get a management system. There will be in the next couple of years an ISO net zero standard. Look out for that. If you haven't gone to SBTI yet, and it might take you a couple of years, maybe wait for ISO, because that has got continual improvements. Behavioral change, I'm going to speed up now because I think I've 10 minutes left. Precedents. I wrote the environmental precedents for LexisNexis, and I've upgraded them recently with net zero and ESG. Precedents are really, really important. I went to a law firm and thought, how comes you've never sent me any environmental work? And the answer was actually, well, we never include environmental questions in our legal questionnaires. What do you do? In the letter of engagement, we won't cover environmental. How can you not cover environmental when it's one of the biggest issues now? Anyway, the other thing for lawyers, accountants, sustainability consultants have kind of taken most of this market. They saw this, companies like Anthesis, a breakaway group from WSP that said, in 5 years' time, it's all going to be sustainability. So they made themselves first mover advantage. Boom, now they are massive. And they're actually fantastic. Go to them if you want your ESG strategy or even your media sorted out. But what they don't do is climate contracting. Any big company, any bank has got hundreds of contracts all over the place, anything from a lease to your commercial contract. And they all have to start talking climate. Now, if you're new to this, go to the Chancery Lane project because you get free climate clauses and you can kind of work out your own strategy, but do it very carefully. The last thing I want to talk about is carbon literacy. When I was an environment commissioner, this charity started up in Manchester, and I was very impressed with them, thought they would do well. And 15 years later, they now have 100,000 individuals accredited as carbon literate. That means they've attended 3 2-hour climate change awareness classes that's all about behavioral change. I've gone one step further, and I've qualified as a, thanks Alicia, I've qualified as a carbon literate trainer. It is like a Trojan horse. Every big company needs to encourage, motivate, get people across the workforce to understand the importance of being good to the environment and reducing carbon emissions. And this course basically does what it says in the tin. It makes you really understand what it's the big picture, and it motivates you. And I'm going to use it to speak to clients and improve the environmental stuff as much as I can. And I'd encourage other people on the course on this webinar to check it out. Right. I think that might be near the end. Yes, that, I believe, is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. We have now a few minutes for some questions. We have some in the chat. I'm going to start with how do you see the future legislation about ESG, like in 5 years' time, for example?
The 2 EU directives that I mentioned, had a bit of a phased approach over the next 5 years. So they will still be the main things. It'll be interesting how individual countries implement these directives. But because for the first time, basically in the last 3 years, every big company and the number one layer of supply chain are now doing this. It changes every aspect of work, and I'm not sure what legislation will be, but I do know there's going to be loads of it, and it's better to be prepared now. So if anyone's new to this, please take it from me to just start right now and do it quickly.
We have another question. Is it possible to start regulating forever chemicals right now?
Yes, well, they have been regulated. Oh, lights have just popped up here. They have been regulated at the international level from this kind of POP treaty, Persistent Organic Pollutants Treaty. There's also EU legislation coming up. There's US legislation. We have got only 3 weeks ago new contaminated land guidance for England and Wales. Basically, what's happening with PFAS chemicals, and if anyone's interested in this, please come to me because I know a lot about it. We've got a PFAS collection of experts, not just legal, but through the country. The regulators are concentrating on drinking water because it's effectively can kill us. So they're trying to sort out the PFAS pollution there. They will then go to groundwater. They've already served notices on the airports in England and Wales to basically test your own land, upgrade your permit, do cleanup. So I'm speaking to an airport actually next Tuesday on this. That's really serious because you're talking millions of pounds worth of cleanup. But the big thing is the development industry. We have got all of this, the news with the Labour government just a couple of days ago to say, yeah, let's relax planning rules and have more development, even go into the grey belt. What that will actually mean is developers will be testing for PFAS and development projects will stall. It's very hard to get environmental insurance for it. So you need to understand the environmental liabilities. There will be a raft of legislation on PFAS, and it is moving very, very quickly. Basically, every month there's a new development. If you're new to PFAS, check it out because it is very, very scary.
Regarding the forever chemicals, Nathan asked, how can we decrease our exposure to forever chemicals, and if it's even possible now?
How can you decrease? Well, unfortunately, it's one of these scandals. It's in non-stick frying pans, for example. If you have an old frying pan that's in bad condition and there's a little bit of flakes on it, throw it out because that's got PFAS in it. If you have lots of outdoor weather gear that's waterproof, just kind of, if you're buying new stuff, try and have PFAS free. You cannot get away from PFAS. You have to kind of trust like the drinking water inspectorate and stuff to be trying to take this out of the drinking water. But the fact is, it is in our blood already. You can just basically the same. If the environment could talk, it's basically be nice to the environment, be nice to animals. It's a non-brainer. But buy cruelty-free and PFAS-free stuff wherever you can and keep it natural.
Well, I think this is going to be the end of the webinar. We had another question, but for all the attendees, we will be sharing Keith's details via email later. So if any of you have more questions, you can reach him directly. We want to thank you very much, Keith, for this super interesting webinar, and also Irwin Mitchell for collaborating with us today. And thank you to all the attendees that joined us this afternoon. So if you have any questions, you can reach Keith directly or visit our website, reach out any colleague of the Chamber. We will be more than happy to help. So now, thank you all the attendees. Thank you, Keith, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Good luck
Bye.
with the football.
Thank you.
All the best.